Okay, well, welcome to 10 Types of Sentences Every Scientific Paper Should Have. My name is Joe Munch. I'm a scientific editor in scientific publications in the Research Medical Library. And today we're going to be talking about some kind of essential elements that your manuscripts need to be easily readable and successful. So, why do we need to talk about these types of sentences? Well, your manuscript is the report of your research, and you've finished your study, you've interpreted your results, and now all that's left to do is to write that all up. But the caveat of that is that if you write in such a way that reviewers can't understand you, nobody's going to appreciate your study. So in this short webinar, I'm going to be talking about some things that you can do to improve accessibility to your writing and to make your manuscript easily understandable. So I'll go ahead and turn off the video right now so we're not distracted, and get right into it. Okay, so we're going to go through these kind of one IMRAD section at a time. IMRAD being the introduction, methods, results, and discussion of your manuscript. So again, why these 10 types of sentences? If you think of your manuscript, it's a story of your science. And as that story, it needs kind of markers of where people are within that narrative and what they can expect. And when reviewers and readers read your paper, they're going to want to find some very specific information. So it's important to put this information in a place where reviewers and readers can find it easily, but also to present it in such a way that is very clear that you are addressing the questions that they might have. For example, why was this study done? What did you do for experiments? What did you find? And so forth. The other reason we're talking about these 10 types of sentences is because they're going to minimize the possibility that you would be misunderstood in your writing. There's a tendency, I think, for scientific writers to kind of assume a lot of their readership, to kind of assume that their readers will know what they're talking about, and so they don't have to explicitly say what they're talking about, which we'll get into that as we go through. But it's, I think, very important to kind of use these guideposts to tell reviewers and readers, yes, this is what we're talking about in the paper now, just to make sure that the manuscript is extremely easy and understandable. So the first few sentences that every manuscript should have, they appear in the introduction section. And these types of sentences tend to appear towards the end of the introduction section. And the first of those sentences is the gap in knowledge. Now, you know that the introduction kind of works from a broad base of knowledge through what is known to this, which is what is unknown. This is the question that your study sought to fill. A sentence stating the gap explicitly should be provided because it will leave no question in readers' minds what the study sought to do. So here's some examples. Now, a gap in knowledge statement could identify an unknown, as in the role of protein X expression in breast cancer remains unclear, or it could identify that there's some controversy or some disagreement over what is known out there, as in the few studies that have investigated protein X expression in breast cancer have yielded inconsistent findings. But whatever it is, it should be explicitly stated. Now, after you give that gap in knowledge, the next statement you need to include in your manuscript is a statement or two or three about the importance of filling that gap. And it's given immediately after the gap in knowledge, and it says why the study is worthwhile. In other words, it explains, or at least gives a taste to readers, what the study makes possible with its completion. So if our gap is this, the role of protein X expression in breast cancer remains unclear, the important statement might look something like this. An improved understanding of this role would facilitate the development of novel treatments for the disease. Now, again, you might find it necessary to use 2, 3, maybe even a full paragraph to explain the importance of filling this gap, but it's imperative that you do so. And now there's an assumption to say, well, readers will inherently understand why it's important to do this. But I would argue that you should leave no question in their mind why this is important. This reminds them of the importance, one, and it also demonstrates that you grasp the importance of your own work. So after you've given the gap in knowledge and you've explained its importance, now it's time to talk about how you're going to fill that gap. And that's where you give a purpose or a hypothesis statement. And this is a fairly straightforward sentence. So some examples here. But it's a very straightforward sentence. It should be indicated with phrases like, the purpose of this study was to do, or in the present study we tested the hypothesis, or whatever it is. But there should be some kind of marker there, again, kind of a red flag that cues readers into the idea that this is what you set out to do. So that sentence is needed in the introduction. Now let's move to the methods. Now, when you talk about your experiments, there's really just one type of statement that should always be included, and it's included over and over and over again, ideally. And this is a statement explaining the reasons for the experiments, why you did what you did. And it's given at the methods before each description of a certain experiment or set of experiments. So in an IMRAD formatted paper, so when the methods appear immediately after the introduction, you need to say why these experiments were done. But in an ERDAM manuscript, so one where the results actually appear first, you say at the beginning of each results section or each set of results the experiments that were performed, but also why those experiments were performed. So these types of sentences are important because they orient readers to the study design. So some very straightforward examples here. So to assess protein X expression, we subjected 100 tumor samples to IHC analysis. We performed a long-range analysis to compare the Kaplan-Meier survival estimate of patients with protein X expression with that of patients without protein X expression. Now, again, I'd like to emphasize, because I see this a lot in the methods, that there's a lack of these types of sentences. But what that does when these sentences don't appear, when they don't explain to the reader why you're doing something, the reader's left to do additional work. They have to figure it out for themselves why you chose to do these experiments. They have to piece together your study design from what they know. So instead of kind of guiding readers through this narrative of your science, instead of telling them and explaining the reasons for doing your experiments, you're allowing them to kind of make their own conclusions about that. And when you do so, there can be some potential for misunderstanding. Now, moving from the methods section and into the results, the next type of sentence that your paper should include is one indicating the sources of the findings you're describing. So as it's important in the methods to say why you did a certain experiment, it's important in the results to say where the findings came from. Because again, if you don't, readers are left to guess. And that makes them do more work. And more work for readers means they're less likely to appreciate the conclusions that you want to bring them to. Okay, so again, it's important to give the sources of your findings because it clues readers into the study design and it helps eliminate any potential for confusion. So if in the methods you say that to assess protein X expression, we subjected 100 tumor samples to IHC analysis, your results might read something like this. IHC analysis revealed strong protein X expression in 50 of 100 tumor samples. These make nice kind of pairings between the methods and the results. You know, every scientific manuscript should have a method for every result, a result for every method, and using these types of sentences are going to help you, they'll really help you align these methods and results to one another. And that can be done by repetition of keywords. So you can see how this helps the reader do as little work as possible to understand your study and what you found. So in the methods, if you have another example here of performing this log rank analysis, you would have in the results a similar sentence with repetition of keywords. Okay, so that's introduction, methods, results. Now we're going to move into the discussion section, and this is where the bulk of these types of sentences need to be included, because many people find the discussion section very difficult to write, and kind of along those same lines, readers can often be confused when they're reading the discussion because they're given information, but they don't know what to do with it. So let's talk a little bit about the sentences that you can use to help ensure that readers will understand you. So we advocate beginning your discussion with a statement of your study's conclusions. This is the statement that's going to answer your research question. It's going to fill the gap in knowledge that you stated in your introduction. And its wording should reflect that of the purpose or the hypothesis statement. So if your purpose was to elucidate the role of protein X expression in breast cancer, your conclusion might look like this. The findings of this study suggest that protein X expression promotes breast cancer. And again, it's helpful to repeat key terms. Now, one of the reasons we say to put the conclusion at the beginning of the discussion section is because it's going to help streamline your discussion. A lot of people might say, well, the conclusion seems to naturally fit at the end of the discussion section. And while I see the merit in that, I think that giving readers what they want up front in the discussion, they want to know if your study supported your hypothesis or if your purpose was achieved. Putting it up front is going to help make that discussion all the more easy to write, but also it will streamline it and make it easier for readers to follow. Now here's some generic conclusion, some generic wording that might begin your conclusion statement. Now, when you give your conclusion, it's important that you do not repeat the results of your study. So in this case, if the purpose was to determine the toxic effects of drug X, and the finding is that 25 patients who took drug X, of those, 20 developed hand-foot syndrome, a poor conclusion would be that 80% of patients who received drug X develop hand-foot syndrome. Well, that's because, 80% of 25 is 20. This statement essentially repeats the finding. A better conclusion might look like this, because it provides some interpretation of that finding. Our results indicate that hand-foot syndrome is a toxic effect of drug X. So a little cautionary there. Just be sure that your results are interpreted in that conclusion section, not repeated. Moving from the conclusion, let's talk a little bit about topic sentences. Now, these are used throughout the manuscript, but I find that they're extremely helpful in the discussion because this is where you often have the most paragraphs that require a kind of the main idea of a paragraph to be put front and center. So it can be difficult to follow who did what and whether the information that you're talking about is from the present study, from somebody else's study. So these types of sentences are going to clue readers into why you're talking about what you're talking about in that paragraph. And in the discussion section, these types of sentences typically relate to the study's findings. So here are some generic examples. So say your study uncovers something new and exciting, you might use something like this. The results of the study provide new insight into the role of protein X expression in breast cancer. What would follow would be a description of perhaps what was already known about the relationship before your study, and then what the new information brings to that understanding of the relationship. Maybe if your study found some similarities across different areas, you might have a sentence like this: our findings regarding protein X expression in breast cancer are not unlike those reported for ovarian, colorectal, and bladder cancer. And that paragraph would go on to summarize those findings and explain what this agreement means. Or maybe your study showed something completely different from what has been found before. So in this example, the results of our survival analysis stand in stark contrast to the findings of Smith et al., who found something completely different. In this case, you would summarize those findings and perhaps explain what might be accounting for these differences. But the important, kind of the main takeaway here is that each of these types of sentences immediately clues readers into what you're going to talk about. Now, our eighth type of sentence that should be included in every scientific manuscript is limitations and strengths. Now, these are given in the discussion, usually towards the end. They're often in the second to last paragraph. And what they do is that they acknowledge and they refute, if possible, the limitations of the study. In refuting the limitations of the study, highlighting the study's strengths are going to help cushion any criticism based on those limitations, whether they're real or perceived. So, a very generic topic sentence for that kind of paragraph, a limitation statement, what is our study had a few potential limitations. Now, that might be a huge understatement, but it's useful because it tells reviewers, here come the study limitations. Now, a better sentence would explain what the limitation is and also say why it might not be such a limitation. Now, this is kind of a classic example. Our study was limited by its retrospective nature and small sample size, which in another study might both be limitations. But in this study, they say that the tumor they studied is extremely rare, making prospective studies infeasible and large sample sizes almost impossible to obtain. So in that brief statement, the limitations are actually turned on their ear. They actually potentially become strengths of the study. Some ways to talk about strengths might include sentences that begin with something along these lines. This is basically where you say that even though our study, like every study, has limitations, it also has something valuable, something not yet done in the literature, for example. And so these types of sentences, again, are going to kind of remind reviewers, okay, we had some limitations, but our study remains strong, and therefore it's valid and important. Okay, we're moving now to the very last paragraph of the discussion section, and this includes 2 of the 10 types of sentences that every paper should include. And the first is the statement of the overall implications of the study. You can use this type of statement or 2 to reemphasize how scientific thought or patient care can or should change as a result of your study. So here are some examples. You know, they're kind of broad examples, but what these types of sentences do is they put a bit of an exclamation point on the discussion section. They remind readers and reviewers that this study was worthwhile, that this study has positive impact. Okay, and finally, the 10th and final type of sentence is a future direction sentence. This is often the final sentence of the discussion, and what it does is identifies what should be done or could be done given the results of your study. It shows that your study isn't kind of alone in a vacuum, but that it actually lies on this continuum of research. again, some really generic examples here. And you can use this sentence to say either, what others should do, in general, future studies should investigate, or you could say what you plan to do. Our next study will investigate this issue. Okay, well, that's it. I mean, if your manuscript contains these 10 types of sentences, readers are going to be able to understand and appreciate the importance of your study. Again, I've just kind of walked you through the IMRAD format, but they're equally applicable to the ERDAM format. All right. So while we're taking questions, and please, if you have any questions, just go ahead and put them in the chat box. Some contact information here. If you enjoyed this webinar, would like to see some more, we have those posted on our Inside site. And if you're looking for help with writing your manuscripts and or your grants, you can contact us at the telephone number or the email. And if you're really adventurous, you can come visit us in 1MC. We're up here on floor 16. So thank you, and I'd welcome any questions you have. Yeah, we will post the slides alongside the recording, I believe, so they should be available, yes. Oh, and the formats I mentioned. So the two formats I mentioned are colloquially IMRAD and ERDAM. So IMRAD is a paper that's formatted introduction followed by the methods, results, and discussion. And that's a format that's, I think that's the main one that's used largely throughout, especially the clinical sciences. The other format is what we call ERDAM, where the results follows the introduction. So it goes introduction, introduction, results, discussion, and then the methods. And you see that kind of format a lot in basic sciences. Okay, and as I was looking at the camera, I might have missed some questions. So okay. Looks like we're good. Okay, well, if there are no questions further, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you so much for joining me today. Happy writing.